leverage both federal, state, and institutional aid to serve the students. This report came out in March. You can find it on our CSAC website, read through it, see what was proposed. We were attempting to propose in this a fairly large budget augmentation to make it work. And unfortunately, as many of you know, the state budget in 2020 and COVID effectively put that on halt. And so we still had a very good proposal here, and shortly thereafter, CSAC was asked to relook at this particular proposal and potentially modify it and see, well, what could we do if we actually just use the existing funds that we had now, assuming no new funds were going to be available in the future. So we kept our focus on the main policy changes that we had pretty good consensus on. We wanted to adopt expected family contribution, or EFC, as the primary metric determining student need. So EFC is used for Pell and is calculated in the FAFSA. California and Cal Grants use a California-specific income and asset ceiling set of numbers, which are different than EFC, to award Cal Grants. And so there's a disunion between these two. So we want to convert everything to EFC. Number two, we want to remove the eligibility barriers that are based on age, time out of high school, and GPA. So these eligibility barriers have been put up over the course of 50 years of the genesis of Cal Grants and the various different programs. They're also used somewhat as a rationing device. They're confusing, different GPAs, different time out of high school, things like that. So we certainly wanted to simplify that. And these are the things we're going to keep in the proposals that we're going to talk about here today. So essentially what we're proposing here are two separate Cal Grant programs. A unique Cal Grant program called Cal Grant 2, specifically for California community college students, and a Cal Grant 4 for students who are going to the various four-year institutions that Cal Grant serves. I'll start with the Cal Grant 2 proposal. What we are proposing here is that all eligible students who have 0 EFC, who are attending a California community college, get a Cal Grant stipend. So a Cal Grant 2, as proposed, is a stipend. Tuition and fees are primarily going to be waived for these students with the Promise Program grants at the community colleges. So that part we don't necessarily need to address. So these are stipends, and they would be for students at 0 EFC in community colleges. We would get rid of any GPA verification requirements for this. We would eliminate any time out of high school and age requirements to get one. Given that this is just for community college students, we could move the application deadline for this back to September 2 instead of March, which is what we use for the existing Cal Grants. By doing so, this would increase the number of eligible students to get a stipend from the current amount, 124,000 students, to 280,000 students, which is a pretty significant increase in the number of students. One of the ways in which we can do this with the same amount of money, which is roughly about 150 million, which is what's going to community college students currently, is by separating out Cal Grant 2 stipends from students with dependent children stipends. So you've got students in the community college system who have dependent children, some do not. What we're proposing here is if you are not a student with dependent children, you get a Cal Grant 2 stipend. If you are a student with dependent children, you would get a student with dependent children stipend, which comes from a completely separate pot of money. And I'll talk about that in a minute. I'll give you a couple of options for distributing this $150 million for Cal Grant 2. Option number one, since we are increasing the number of eligible students, we would reduce the stipend amount to accommodate that. So currently stipends are $1,656. In this option, if all students at 0 EFC get a stipend, they would each get roughly about $1,250. Or option two here is if we kept that $1,656 amount, we would have to ration somehow, probably a first come, first served type of situation, and roughly 75% of the eligible pool would get that $1,656. This analysis here shows you the distribution of what changes when we move from income and asset ceilings to using EFC as the cutoff. So for community college students, currently you've got 124,260 awards. You can see what percentage of them are at 0 EFC. You can see their average income, their average age, various demographic cuts. Under the new model, you can see it bumps up to 280. All of them are 0 EFC, so it's certainly a more needy group. Their average income goes down, their average age goes up. And the in and out line are basically what's modeled here for new students. Under any proposal, any student who's currently in, we're not going to kick out, but they would be grandfathered. So this is, the outline here is who would no longer be eligible under the new formula if they were a new student. This is who is not going to be served, but you can see it's greatly offset by who's coming in. The group of students who are out would have been eligible before, and you can see none of them were at 0 EFC. They have a much higher average income, very young group, hardly any are students with dependent children, etc. So if you look at the trade-off that we're making here, and your goal is to try and get to a more needier group of students, this type of allocation does it by moving to 0 EFC as your cutoff. So I talked about students with dependent children and their proportion in the Cal Grant 2 pool. What we're proposing here is all eligible students with dependent children also at 0 EFC would get a stipend. In this case, it would be across all public sectors, including community colleges, CSU and UC, who are currently eligible. Almost all of these are already at community college. There are a few students with dependent children at CSU and UC who would continue to get this stipend. In fact, 28% of all 0 EFC students in community colleges are students with dependent children. So like I said before, a community college student would get either an SWDC grant or a Cal Grant 2. In this case, the SWDC grant as modeled would be about $2,800. So they get a little bit more. Okay, moving on to what we've proposed and modeled here for Cal Grant 4. So this is for students going to CSU, UC, the independent and some of the for-profit colleges, and also students who have gone to community college and now transferring into those institutions. What we're proposing here is that if you are eligible to receive a Pell Grant, you would be eligible for a Cal Grant 4 to cover your tuition and fees. So the Pell Grant cutoff in EFC terms is around 55.76, I believe. No age and time out of high school requirements. There would be no more delay for some students of waiting a year before their tuition and fees would be covered. And a real biggie here is lowering the GPA cutoff from 3.0 down to 2.0, which is basic eligibility for most institutions, especially at CSU. We are leaving a good chunk of students out who don't meet the 3.0 GPA, and we certainly add some diversity to the pool by lowering this GPA cutoff. We're currently spending about a little over $2.1 billion on students' tuition and fee entitlements. And this is actually pretty close to a push. There would be no net change here. We would need a small amount of money to make up the difference. Here's what Cal Grant 4 looks like. We actually do add new students to the rolls here because one of the things that's going away are stipends that would be going to students in the four-year institutions. And that is something that we would be wanting to talk about using institutional aid at those segments to pay. So the number of awards goes up from 132,000 to 172,000. If you look at the in and out, you can see you pick up more 0 EFC students. The students who are no longer eligible have a much higher income. Once again, it's a good target of funds, especially if you're looking to target more needy student populations. So that's Cal Grant 4. Finally, we're looking at all the sources here of financial aid, and middle class scholarship is certainly a pot. It's also a little over 125 million. What we would propose for MCS is that these would become fixed amount awards. Right now they're variable based on a lot of factors. It would be much easier to administer MCS if they were fixed amount. The floor of MCS as proposed would start where the upper boundary of Cal Grant 4 ends. So basically just above the Pell cutoff line. So what we would say here is if you're not eligible for Pell, you definitely are eligible for a middle class scholarship. We would need to convert MCS to an EFC based eligibility, eliminate MCS as a last dollar award, and award MCS based upon the amount of money that we had available to it from lower to higher EFC, basically until you exhausted all the funds. There's a few ways you could do this. I've put some theoretical upper boundary cutoffs on MCS. If you cut it off at 300% Pell, you add a few more MCS awards to it. The award amounts as percentage of tuition go to 3250 and 1500. And I put here basically a bell curve of what these income cutoffs look like to show you, okay, we are dealing with students who are in the middle class. If you cut it off at 400 Pell, you get more offers. Certainly the award amount goes down, but you reach higher up into income levels. 500% Pell, you get almost 100,000 awards, and the upper boundary extends all the way up to 176,000. Option 2 is even simpler. If you don't do MCS based upon percentage of tuition, and you just say an MCS award is a fixed amount. And for instance, and I just chose these arbitrarily, if you make an MCS award a fixed $2,000, regardless of where you're going, we will net 58,500 awards. If you make them 1,000, you net double that number of awards. That would be very simple to administer. Option 3 tapers it like Pell. So if you have more need and are, just above the Pell cutoff, you could get a bigger MCS award. And spreading over down onto the right tail, you'd get less and less as your income was higher. So those are some of the options for MCS. You can see we've also taken a bit of a holistic view. What we're really trying to achieve is a situation here where students, based upon their need, there's a contiguous eligibility curve here. There's no holes in between certain areas that have to be backfilled by other sources. We want a contiguous, smooth eligibility, starting from the neediest getting the most and on out to the very upper tail of middle class scholarship. Okay, I'll stop there. I know that was quick and brief, and there's a ton of details, I'm sure, in there that we could probably get into, but I'm going to turn it back to Jake to introduce our panel.
Thank you, Patrick. And on that very note, huge amount of detail and information that Patrick has just provided and walked through for you all, particularly if you might be newer to the Cal Grant, let alone the Cal Grant reform conversation. So what I failed to do at the top of the breakout session, and I will do now, is call attention to our Q&A box. Please, audience members, feel free to submit your questions there. My colleague at the commission, Melissa Bardo, will be helping field your questions about Patrick's presentation, or if you have questions that you might like to pose to our panelists, we will be opening up the Q&A box and posing some questions from there at the end of our panel discussion here. So please feel free to drop any questions you might have coming to mind, or any reactions to what Patrick's presented into the Q&A box. So with that, I want to move us to our panel discussion. I am, as I said earlier, very excited to get to help facilitate an incredible lineup of speakers today, including two of the individuals who participated in CSAC's Cal Grant Reform Work Group that Patrick spoke to, as well as the president for the Student Senate for California Community Colleges. So I will very briefly introduce our great speakers here today, and then open up the questions I have for them before we get to your questions. So I'm going to give you really kind of the highlights for our speakers here. Their full bios are on our website for the event, so please feel free to check that out as well. The first speaker I wanted to introduce is Stephen Couture, the president for the Student Senate for California Community Colleges, the official voice for the over 2 million students enrolled at our California community colleges. He himself is a student at Reedley College and currently works as a physical education teacher at a local school district and hopes to continue his studies at either Fresno State or one of the UC campuses. Stephen will be joined by, as I mentioned, 2 members of the Cal Grant Reform Work Group, including Debbie Cochran, the Executive Vice President of the Institute for College Access and Success, or as many of us know them, TICAS, and as well as for their project on student debt. Debbie's a nationally recognized expert on financial aid policy and practice. TICAS, if you are not familiar with them, is a trusted source of research, design, and advocacy for student-centered public policies that promote affordability, accountability, and equity in higher education, nationally and here in California, of course. Debbie leads the organization's policy and advocacy work in California higher education issues, provides strategic guidance and support on national policy priorities and advocacy, and oversees the Institute's research work. And the final, last but not least speaker I will introduce here is Audrey Dow, the Senior Vice President of the Campaign for College Opportunity. I'm honored to call her a former colleague. And the Campaign for College Opportunity is a California-based policy research and advocacy organization dedicated to ensuring that more students go to and succeed in college. Audrey is also a sought-after expert on issues of college access, success, affordability, and racial equity, speaking regularly at state and national convenings, much like this. And as a member of the executive team at the campaign, Audrey has a broad range of responsibilities for co-leading the organization's strategic direction, robust research agenda, and leading media communications and coalition building efforts. So with the introductions out of the way now, we'll move over to the questions. And I wanted to begin with Stephen to help us center this discussion around the student experience. So Stephen, from a student perspective, what would you or your peers suggest to us are the most significant barriers in our current approach to providing Cal Grants?
Yeah, thank you, Jake. Thanks for that question. So as far as a student's perspective and a student experience, right now as the Cal Grant system is set up, it doesn't completely serve students. And especially it doesn't serve students who begin in the California community college system or even low-income students. And as Patrick was saying earlier, it's really due to the whole rationing system. It's the eligibility requirements. Less than 5% of our students actually receive a Cal Grant right now. And these are students that really need it, right? So the Cal Grant program, it provides the entitlement awards. But those awards go to recent high school graduates or students that are transferring into higher education. And this really limits the beneficiaries of those rewards. So they've not just become requirements, but they've actually become inequitable barriers that students have to go through. And a lot of them are not something that you can just fix, right? It's just, you're too old. Like I can't go back in time and change my age, right? So for myself specifically, I came into the California community college system at 24, and I really had no chance. Right now, California community college students, over 40% of them are actually over the age of 25. They come to the system after several years out of high school. A vast majority of them receive the fee waiver. So our state is already saying you don't even make enough money to be able to pay for your tuition. But hey, guess what? You don't get a Cal Grant either. So, we're limiting these students as it is. So I think the way that the Cal Grant system is set up right now, like I said, at about 5% of those students receive a Cal Grant. And it's really time to stop discriminating against the California community college students because of their age, their time out of high school restrictions, and the financial aid distributions and that are based right now on competition instead of need. We really need to focus more on the student need aspect. And I'd love to get into that more later.
Thank you, Stephen. Along with our students, as Stephen has so effectively called out some of these issues they're facing right now, along with the students, TCAS has been at the forefront of calling out how insufficient the current approach to financial aid is in addressing basic needs and serving these students who are so often left out of the Cal Grant program. Debbie, I'm hoping that you could speak to the principles TCAS would suggest that we apply when considering how we leverage the state's investment in financial aid.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jake. We actually have kept two solid principles core to all of our work on Cal Grants, and this is true through the last recession and through all the budget years that we've had since then that were much more favorable. Those are that with whatever dollars we have, and that's whether it's 1 billion, 2 billion, 3 billion, we need to focus the spending that we do have on the students with the greatest financial need. Over the last few years, the Cal Grant program has actually turned away more than half of all eligible applicants because too few awards were available, the types of students that Stephen was just talking about. And most of the students that we turned away as a state had an EFC of 0. So to the extent that increased dollars are available, or frankly, decreased dollars are sometimes available, that is the student population, those with the greatest need we need to focus on. The other key principle that we've focused on in coalition with our partners is the need to focus on total college costs. It's not just the tuition bill that students need to pay, as we focused on a lot when the current Cal Grant program was created. It's a critical component because paying the tuition bill only buys you access to college. But enabling students to succeed in college requires that they have the resources they need so that they can focus on school more than working to earn money for rent, food, books, or transportation. And then the final one I would add, which is very much first and foremost in my mind right now, is that as we make changes to Cal Grants, we need to consider, during the sensitive time, we need to consider also whether the changes we're making are making the program more resilient in the face of budget downturns or recessions or less. So when we look back over the last 2 decades, the places that the program has grown and affordability has best been protected are for the students whose eligibility is linked to something that grows over time. The places where the value of grants to students has stagnated are the places where the number of grants or the size of the grants is effectively an arbitrary number based exclusively on what the state wants to or feels like it can pay from year to year. So we need to keep these lessons close to our heart as we think about how we make steps in the next coming years.
Thank you, Debbie. I think you've put a few very important considerations for us to hold in mind today and moving forward as we consider what we can do to better leverage Cal Grant funds in support of our most financially vulnerable students. Audrey, I wanted to ask you the next question here. Being at the campaign, a leader on questions of educational equity and regularly engaging in a range of issues in the higher education realm, how do you see financial aid and our current approach to Cal Grants as fitting into the discussion on other issues like college access, transfer, or student success?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks so much again for inviting me to participate today, Jake. It's always good to see you and everyone who's on this panel. The way that we currently have Cal Grant designed is fundamentally inequitable. And it is racially and ethnically inequitable. When we think about the fact that, when you look at students of color, Latino students, Black students, communities within, our Asian American Pacific Islander communities, when you look at where they go to college, over 70% of those groups start at a California community college. And if you look at that then by the aid that is available to them, they are the groups that are shortchanged. And those are the very groups that we need to be able to have access to college opportunity because they represent the majority of our populations here in California. I think that our current Cal Grant system is flawed in that it fails to recognize who our students are today. And Debbie and Stephen, talked about this earlier today. We don't have that traditional 18-year-old coming out of high school really anywhere anymore. Our students are generally older. They generally have, children. They are, often responsible for for the financial health of their households, whether or not they have children or not. Many of these students, our students today, are supporting their families. And, you know, I know we'll talk a little bit later about the COVID-19 pandemic, but the pandemic has really made it much more acute in terms of the responsibility, the financial responsibilities that are falling on our students' shoulders at a time when we have a system that has fundamentally is saying to students, not you. We are here, we say we have open access for you, but we aren't going to give you the resources that you need to be successful. We know that the real cost and perceived cost of what college is can be the barrier for many of our communities of color. And if students know at the front end that not only their tuition / fees will be covered, but that they'll also have a stipend available to them, that significantly increases the likelihood that they will enroll and that they will persist. And so, you know, right now the message we're sending, you know, community college students, which is the majority of our students, the message we're sending them is, you know, 7 out of 8 of you aren't going to get $1. Good luck. And I don't think that's the college going message we should be sending our students.
Thank you for that, Audrey. And I think that fits very closely along the lines of some of the discussion earlier this morning in the general sessions of the summit, where we've been talking about how do we follow through on what we profess about higher education opportunity and equity? How do we follow through with our action and actually demonstrate through where we invest and how we create support for students, demonstrate that commitment? And I'd like to now, we've been discussing the current situation, the barriers our students are facing. Audrey, you started to kind of evoke COVID and some of the issues we're wrestling with, not only now, but for the next several months. So I wanted to start to pivot the next set of questions for you all towards the path forward and how Cal Grant Modernization fits in there. So for Stephen, I'm wondering if you could share how you think what you think Cal Grant Modernization, if it were successful, what it would mean for students at the community colleges in particular.
Yeah, thank you. Another great question, Jake. I think first and foremost, it means a step in the right direction. It's doubling what our students, or the students that are receiving it right now, right? It would pretty much double, but that's still what, 10% of our student population, a little bit less than 10%, or a little bit more than 10% of our student population. Because right now, in the current system, a low-income student living alone off campus would have to probably work an average around 30 hours a week just to attend a California community college system, or a California community college. You then add in dependence, loss of income due to COVID, and some of the other barriers, and it excludes them from accessing financial aid. So this would definitely bridge that gap. We're doubling the amount of students that will actually receive that. That's awesome. It's a step in the right direction. But for our students, you know, a part-time student doesn't mean that they have part-time needs. For myself, like when I first came into the California community college system, I tried to take classes. I wanted to go out for Cal Grant, didn't get it. Well, guess what? I still had food insecurities. I still had transportation insecurities, homeless insecurities. You know, I literally couch surfed for my first 3 semesters. You know, thank goodness for my friends and that allowed me to stay on their couch. I visited my food pantry frequently to try and get you know, ramen and mac and cheese. I rode a longboard for over 10 miles each day to get to class and back because I couldn't afford gas and all of these other things. But I've never received Cal Grant in my life. I've never been able to do that. So the true cost of college is actually, it's pretty crazy because the California community college system now becomes the most expensive option, right? We're only covering the cost of tuition, and then that's it for our students. So it's really, Cal Grant 2 would definitely start addressing some of these issues and start working us into the right direction. And if it was successful, it would mean finally supporting students, right? It means finally trying to support these students that really need it. It means realizing that we should account for the whole cost of college, not just tuition. It would mean realizing and really recognizing that our students are diverse working adults, you know, and we're trying to support them, and in turn we're actually supporting California through this, right? We're pushing these kids out and actually making them be successful. I think the RP group made a great survey pretty recently that said that our African American students are actually the least likely to get through the transfer portal. Why is that? Right? Why is that? It's because of the barriers that are presented to them in their journey in the California community college system. The Hispanic population are actually the most likely to get to the transfer portal, but then not transfer. Why is that? More barriers that are presented to them to actually further their education. So we're trying to support an equitable recovery, which actually is equitably reallocating state dollars, right? We want to ensure that our institutions of higher education can continue to function as an engine of economic recovery. We really want to push these students out and really get them into farther higher education, into the workforce, but we need to be able to provide for their needs to be able to do that. So Cal Grant 2 would definitely start to address some of those issues.
Thank you for that, Stephen, and thank you for sharing your personal experience and the challenges that you've faced as you've tried to persist in your studies and longboarded great distances to be able to get on campus. You know, one thing I do want to call out that you uplift is the food insecurity that our students are so often experiencing. 35% of the students that participated in the SEER survey I mentioned earlier reported being food insecure. This is, of course, of great concern to all of us that pay attention to these issues and the barriers that our students are facing. And at the Student Aid Commission, we're particularly motivated to see how we can contribute to a solution toward that problem in particular, given that we are already sitting on the financial data of hundreds of thousands of students who are seeking financial aid and indicating that they would like to receive the support available for them to access and succeed in higher education. So just wanted to make a quick mention and plug of a CalFresh work group that the Student Aid Commission has convened with partners from the California Department of Social Services that administers CalFresh, which are the name of the program for the federal SNAP program or food stamps that we administer here in California. There are hundreds of thousands of students, particularly at our community colleges, who we believe would be eligible for CalFresh if they were to apply. So as we think about Cal Grant reform here today and what we can do with our existing dollars in state financial aid, just wanted to mention that we are also at the Student Aid Commission thinking about what role can we play in bringing partners together to see how do we take down that large source of federal funds sitting out there for the claim and bring those to our hungry college students as CalFresh benefits and make that an easier process for them to be able to not only understand, but to get through. So thank you for calling that issue out, Stephen, and starting to speak to what Cal Grant modernization would mean to community college students. I wanted to, in the same vein of thinking about the path ahead, another major change that we've seen in a new dynamic that we'll be welcoming in 2021 is President-elect Biden becoming President Biden and an incoming Biden-Harris administration. TICAS, of course, as I noted earlier, is a leader on not only state, but also federal college affordability issues. So I wanted to ask Debbie about how those intersect in the Cal Grant modernization conversation. And as was noted earlier by Patrick, Cal Grant eligibility is currently based on income and asset thresholds that are separate and apart from the federal expected family contribution calculation. And you know, prior to the election, we'd seen quite a bit of discussion about FAFSA simplification. There was even some chatter about reauthorization of the Higher Education Act, and you know, hope springs eternal that we'll see that one day. It's quite overdue. But curious, Debbie, if you could speak to, given the change in the federal political landscape, you know, and Cal Grant modernization potentially moving to a system aligned with expected family contribution, how these conversations layer over each other and our approach to state-based aid here in California.
It's a great question. I'm going to foreshadow that my response might be a little unsatisfying, which is really just that revamping federal needs analysis could have huge implications for state aid programs, any state aid program that's based on eligibility for federal aid. But it's really hard to know what it would mean before we get there and before we do it. The federal needs analysis system is built with a whole bunch of different variables, and every one of them plays a role in getting the output of a student's expected family contribution, which is the determinant of eligibility for aid, including Pell Grants, Cal Grants, and all sorts of aid. So, which elements would be removed and to what end would have differing effects on different types of students. On the one hand, you could envision changes being implemented that would restrict students' eligibility in ways that didn't appeal to California policymakers. And, if we had a reform system, maybe the state would want to course correct for that in its own eligibility determinations. On the other hand, you could envision that the changes would potentially expand students' eligibility that would make it cost prohibitive for California to offer all Pell Grant recipients a Cal Grant. So it's really hard to know or say. It would require the state working through at the state level what those changes mean, how they filter down to California students, whether those are intended or unintended effects or attractive or unattractive effects, and then make changes to the state programs accordingly. Now, in terms of likelihood, I think that some of the biggest proponents for revamping federal needs analysis in recent years have been congressional leaders. Really hoping, as you mentioned, Jake, to make headway during reauthorization of the Higher Education Act, which, as you noted, was last done in 2008. I think while we've got a while to go before we really know the makeup of the Senate in particular, we do know that it will look different going forward, and we also know that there's some turnover in key leadership positions in the Senate in particular. So I'm not sure, I'm not sure we'll see a Higher Education Act reauthorization in 2021 with, revamping of federal needs analysis. That said, that's not at all to say I don't think it won't be an active year for higher education from the federal policy perspective. I think we can expect a lot of activity from the Biden administration very early on. The president-elect has a very robust higher education agenda spanning free college to doubling Pell. The president-elect wants to reinstate protections to ensure that for-profit colleges are proving their value, make sure students get relief when they don't, and that also all borrowers have access to manageable student loan repayment plans. So some of those steps will be off the table with a divided Congress, but there's still a lot of room left for administrative improvements to move forward through executive action or even to pursue smaller but still important reforms with bipartisan basis through Congress, like restoring eligibility to formerly incarcerated students.
Thank you, Debbie, for sharing all of that helpful context and some perhaps some management of expectations we should have too around what we might see immediately with that turnover in congressional leadership. I'm thinking of Senator Lamar Alexander, the outgoing chair of the HELP committee that oversees education, and his frequent use of the paper long form FAFSA. So we'll miss that nice visual. Hopefully someone will pick up that baton and continue with it. But that being said, we know we've also seen a lot of improvement to the FAFSA process itself that was made through executive action and made through administrative changes implemented by the Department of Education. So hopefully, if we don't see the kind of bold congressional leadership on those issues that we would like to, hopefully we will still see some of those improvements being made over time at the administration. I wanted to transition now to Audrey. And wanted to get back to the COVID issue that you invoked earlier. Obviously, it's why we're meeting virtually today, and it's had major impacts across not only higher education, but really all aspects of our daily life. And it will likely be something we're grappling with even well after a vaccine is developed, as we're starting to overcome the backlog of challenges that are being created now in this time. And we've, of course, already seen an effect on student enrollment. This was mentioned earlier, too, during our general session. And we've seen, at some community colleges in particular, a significant and very concerning decline, particularly in first-time freshman student enrollment. We also know that typically economic recession has created a need for educational pathways that can help individuals reskill and retool and prepare themselves for reentry into the workforce and hopefully to be able to contribute back to California's own economic and health recovery. So Audrey, I'm wondering, I know I threw a lot out there, but if you could please share your thoughts on how we might think about Cal Grant modernization in that COVID context and recession, I should add.
Right. So thanks for the question, Jake. And I think, like in so many other areas, I think COVID-19 has really laid bare the real holes in our existing programs. I think that when COVID first hit, there was a lot of scrambling, right, to get emergency aid out to students. And there's been some really great analysis that I think is eye-opening for policymakers and for all of those involved in the decision to reform Cal Grant. And I think it really provides the impetus for why we need to reform Cal Grant. First of all, when College Futures Foundation got together with the Mission Asset Fund to do, rapid response $500 grants, some of what we've learned, from those students who got that aid is that, they were relying on a lot of different methods to kind of cobble together their livelihoods. As a result of lost income, either themselves losing income or family members losing income. Stephen and Debbie have referenced some of these items already. We know that, students have gone without food, they're foregoing several basic needs. They are working more, they're working longer hours, they're taking on multiple jobs. But some of what I don't think has been shared enough is that, a lot of those things are acute in the right now, foregoing food, maybe being housing unstable. But what we've also learned is that students are taking out payday loans. Students are maximizing credit cards, to pay for the basic needs that they have. Students are opting not to pay bills. Those have long-term implications for people's ability to really just have the basics that good credit offers students, their ability later on to buy a house, to buy a car at an affordable rate, or to take out a loan that isn't predatory. And so I think that, and even to get a job, right? Many jobs require a credit check. And so, there are real long-term implications right now to the fact that we are not adequately supporting students with the needs that they have. So what we've also learned in this is that, these emergency grants, in particular, the ones that College Futures and Mission Asset Fund put out there were $500 grants. And for some folks, you might think, wow, $500 for a semester or for a summer is insignificant. And what we learned is that it's not insignificant. For many of these students, the $500 that they received meant the difference between them going hungry and not. But more importantly, it meant the difference in retention. That $500 gave students a sense that they had some control over finances, that they could stay enrolled in school. And so as I think about the opportunities that we have for modernization, of course, all of us want to go deeper within the pool of students that we have. We'd love to give students every dollar that we could to help them stay in school and be enrolled. But if we can go broader and offer just, slightly smaller grants, but significantly expand the pool to another, 50,000, 100,000 students, that would be, I think, the significant reform that we're all looking for, and policymakers should be thinking about it. I also want to just add that there's a real urgency, I think, to modernizing Cal Grant, and I think policymakers need to be listening up right now. We have students who are not enrolling in school. because of COVID, because they have to work. And we're going to see that happen next year. And what's going to happen in 2 years when we have a vaccine and herd immunity, whatever the case is, when things stabilize again, those students are going to want to come back into a higher education system. And they're going to find themselves ineligible for Cal Grant because they've been out of school for 2 years. And so I think we can't ignore the very real enrollment numbers that we're looking at today that show students not re-enrolling, because that's going to be the pool that's going to be applying in a few years. And as designed today, Cal Grant will keep them out. And that would be a huge, just a huge misstep, I think, for our state. So, you know, that's what why I think we've got to do Cal Grant modernization now. There really is an urgency to it.
Thank you, Audrey. I think it's a challenge enough for us to address the student needs that are so urgent right now, but we cannot lose track of that longer term, slower burning crisis of the students who already weren't on campus this fall. And we know that we're going to have to work even harder to re-engage and bring back into higher ed in the time to come. So
yeah. And Jake, I'll just add one thing. We just had, you know, the National Student Clearinghouse come out with, you know, data just last week on enrollment numbers. And, you know, I just can't emphasize enough that when you break down that data by race and ethnicity and gender, we've had a decline from fall 2019 to fall 2020 in enrollment for Black men and Latinx men of 20%. If we don't modernize Cal Grant, those Black men and Black Latinx men will not find a spot at our public institutions if we keep Cal Grant designed the way it is. And we're going to do it knowingly if we don't act.
An important point for us to hold, you know, and if we think we're immune to that here in California, I think we need to look no further than to the enrollment drops we're seeing at our community colleges, the institutions that predominantly are serving these Black and brown men that you just mentioned, Audrey. So thank you for calling that out. We'll now move over to some questions that we had submitted from our audience members. First, you know, thank you to our panelists. They were exceptional. They make my job as moderator very easy. And I know you all at home are joining me in offering them a virtual round of applause. With that, our first question that I wanted to hit actually is one that I'll pull Patrick back in for, if he can hop on video. But this question was one around this audience member had thought that it might be that Cal Grant dollars were moving from four-year schools to community colleges and could potentially leave a shortfall for the students at the four-year institutions, which they said are more expensive than community college. I think they're probably referring to the tuition rates. Can you clarify, Patrick, that that's not exactly what the model would propose?
Sure, that's not what the model is proposing. In fact, there's no cross subsidy or really any monies that are shifting between currently students who are attending community colleges and the pot of money that we're spending on that and the students that are going to four-year institutions. We reallocated, I mean, we summed it up for each group and we reallocated within those particular amounts. And you know, our hope would be that those two pots grow from that moment forward, but we're not proposing any movement between segments at this time.
Thanks for that clarification, Patrick. Wanted to make sure we nipped that one in the bud early. So the next question that I wanted to get to, and Debbie, I'm thinking maybe we'll start this one with you, but open it up to any panelists, or Patrick, if you would like to take a pass at it as well. The federal financial aid formula does not adjust for high cost of living in many parts of California, this commenter noted. And many families above the Pell cutoff are barely making ends meet and are struggling to pay for college due to a lack of gift aid. How is this being taken into account in our current approach to financial aid or the proposed Cal Grant model that Patrick walked through?
Well, I will, since you pointed to me first, I'll go first and then let Patrick speak about the Cal Grant model. Certainly, I would say that this is not, and in terms of the federal needs analysis revamping, I hope you're very patient as you wait for, for the US Senate to agree that that's a problem. I think that might be a losing battle. I think that the primary way, honestly, that our system currently accounts for living status is on the student side. And with the cost of attendance budget, that every student has a budget that's created for them with an estimate of what they should really be expected to pay or should have a plan for paying with respect to off-campus housing or on-campus, wherever they're planning on living, along with those textbook, transportation, and tuition costs. What's interesting about that as well, all colleges have to do that. You actually see surprisingly little variation from campus to campus. Even when you're looking at something like the Central Valley and the Bay Area, you are seeing very, very similar living cost estimates at these colleges. And I think that's an important factor, for how we think about college affordability as in general. It doesn't necessarily affect Pell Grant eligibility except on the margins, but as we understand what kind of costs students have to pay and what they have to pay out of pocket after that Pell Grant, after the Cal Grant, it's really important that we start with better data. And right now we don't have it. That's why we and some others have actually advocated for the state to get more involved in cost of attendance estimates at the campus by campus level, because if we don't have good numbers, we can't come up with good solutions.
Yeah, I would agree with everything there. In past iterations of these models, especially when we were talking about having an augmented budget, we actually did run some scenarios where we differentiated a stipend amount based upon whether the student was living at home and therefore likely has less housing costs, living at a dorm where we know exactly what the costs are, or living off campus, which does have some variability to it, and geographic variability is part of it. Cal Grant 4 covers tuition and fees. So, I mean, we know what that is and we know what that's paying for. So it really comes down to Cal Grant 2 because it's a stipend paying for living expenses. Since we're starting at such a low level on Cal Grant 2, I mean, we've chosen to expand eligibility versus ration it and getting more students a slightly less amount than what we have now, but that amount is only $1,200. And I don't think we're to a point of that number being big enough for us to begin trying to slice it and dice it further with the complexities of living arrangement and then geography on top of living arrangement. You're already talking about a small amount. Once we get to a higher amount that we're playing with, I think it's a very valid conversation for us to have.
Thanks, Patrick. And I'll just add the note too that one of the, I'll say, counterintuitive findings from the Sears survey that CSAC published last year was that, in fact, housing insecurity was higher in the parts of the state that we might typically think as being lower cost, and that there were large proportions of students in the Central Valley and in far northern California who were, in fact, either housing insecure or homeless. And really kind of conflicts with our understanding, and I say this as a former Oaklander and someone who lived in a very high cost area of the state, conflicts with our understanding of where those costs might typically be borne out. Stephen or Audrey, did either of you want to jump in on this thread as well? Okay.
I just wanted to say I thought it was a great point that's brought up. I actually was born and raised in the Bay Area. The middle of my senior year, my parents moved me to the middle of the Central Valley, and I haven't gone back. And it's not because I didn't want to. All of my family's still out in the Bay Area, but it is infeasible for me off of the income that I make and the non-financial aid that I receive to be able to go back. There's been articles that have been written about students, especially I want to bring out the SF Bay Area, where students are actually, instead of renting apartments and getting into lease agreements out there, they're actually buying old U-Hauls and renovating the back of the U-Hauls into apartments and parking them close to their school. And it's because of the lack of funding that they receive, and that's just a better way for them to utilize their funds. And it's sad to say, you know, and it's sad to see. But I think we need to be a little bit more intentional in how we're reaching these students. As Mr. Perry said, you know, it's $1,200. I mean, that's going to cover my rent for 1 month. And what else do I have for the rest of the semester? You know, unless I'm working already full time. I'm actually at work right now. I had to take a lunch break just to be a part of this panel. So, you know, and other students are out there trying to do the same thing. So, yeah, we definitely need to be more intentional.
Well, we are almost at time, Stephen, so we'll hopefully be able to wrap up for you to get back to work and or at least get part of your lunch break in. And I see that it looks like we've started to exhaust our list of questions here. So I just want to thank our panelists again, thank Patrick for presenting on the current options that we're reviewing right now for Cal Grant modernization. I'll just leave a few quick thoughts here in terms of what the next steps are that we're undertaking at the Student Aid Commission. We were asked by legislators, as I believe Patrick noted earlier in the talk, to come back and to explore how we could, in 2021, knowing that we have these fiscal constraints, still adopt that first phase one of Cal Grant modernization and to remove these eligibility barriers, refocus our financial aid dollars on the students with the most financial need as determined by EFC. So toward that end, what we'll be doing here at CSAC in the coming weeks and months will be to reconvene the Cal Grant Reform Work Group that helped inform the development of the proposal that we released back in March and that this was all premised upon. We'll bring the band back together before the close of the year, hopefully, with the intent of then coming back in January as the legislatures reconvened to take up a Cal Grant modernization proposal and start unpacking these and more issues as we continue to engage our stakeholders, the students, of course, our partners at the institutions and the segments, and our policymakers in Sacramento. So want to thank everyone for taking the time to join this session today. I'd also be remiss if I didn't make a plug for following us on social media. Patrick, I don't know if you can pull up that slide deck again. I think we've got a nice slide there with all of our handles for you to be able to like and or follow as the platform permits. So please stay tuned because we will be continuing to keep those on our social media channels and everywhere else in CSAC's orbit apprised of what we're looking at in the context of Cal Grant modernization. Thank you, Patrick. And there is our social media handles. So thank you again to the panelists, to Patrick, and to all of you for making the time to join us today. Please enjoy a couple minutes here before your next breakout session that I believe starts promptly at 4 o'clock.
Thank you, Jake. Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you.